And Moscow says early results from so-called referendums held in occupied Ukraine show most voters favour joining Russia. The Kremlin's expected to use the outcome to annex 4 regions. Kyiv and its allies describe the votes as sham ballots and are refusing to recognise the results.
Dropping a vote into the ballot box should mean having a say in one's future. But not many Ukrainians believe that's what happened in so-called referendums staged in 4 Russian-held regions of Ukraine. First results showed overwhelming support for joining Russia. Kyiv and the West have already said they would not recognize the outcome of a ballot that Ukraine says was, in some cases, conducted at gunpoint.
There's a small number of people who have to put something like that agreement mark on the ballot. And why? Because a man comes to every house with a rifle and asks them to vote. What should people do when an armed person comes to their home? They're forced to sign the ballot.
A video from Mariupol, shared by the Ukrainian city government in exile, shows armed soldiers following election workers into residential buildings. A warning by Ukrainian authorities that people will face criminal punishment if they vote prompted some to leave, and others to hide behind closed doors. Ukrainian leadership and its Western allies see the referendums as a pretext for the Kremlin to annex the 4 regions: Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. Many ordinary Ukrainians think the same.
It's illegal. They're worse than fascists. It's simply unbearable.
In a chilling warning last week, Vladimir Putin said he would be ready to use nuclear weapons to protect territory he considers part of the Russian Federation. With the war escalating continuously over the last few months, many Ukrainians left their homes long before Moscow staged its so-called referendums on their future. Those who stayed face the likelihood they'll now have to live as citizens of Russia and perhaps even become fighters for its army.
Let's take a closer look at this with DW correspondent Nick Connolly in the Ukrainian capital. Welcome, Nick. Picking up on that last point from the report, what do you think? Would people in occupied regions of Ukraine fight for Russia?
Well, certainly we have already seen signs that Russia is trying to recruit people in these regions, so far with the promise of money and other, occasionally there have been reports of duress and kind of pressure applied to these people. There's definitely a sense that Russia would rather recruit people from Donetsk, from Luhansk, and maybe even Zaporizhzhia, other parts of occupied Ukraine, rather than risking the kind of social conflict we are seeing in the mobilization in Russia itself. As for people being willing to fight against Ukraine, against their own country, it's often going to be a question of how much freedom they have to choose, how much real option they have. We are hearing about people being forced to take passports even before these votes. Anyone working for the government, teachers, doctors, civil servants, basically being given the option of taking a Russian passport or losing their job and their only way of surviving. So this definitely is a prospect that is very scary. And as with the voting in this so-called referenda, we're seeing people just trying to sit it out, hiding from the authorities, the Russian occupation authorities there, sitting in their summer houses, trying to stay at apartments where they're not registered, where the authorities wouldn't know where to look for them, and hope that somehow this passes them by and that something similar happens as Ukraine was able to do in Kharkiv, where they were able to push Russian front lines back, dozens of kilometers in the space of a few days, in the hope that that would then kind of solve the problem for them.
Right. So when the results are eventually declared and, as we presume, the vote goes to a yes, will residents still have a chance to escape?
Well, we've had reports from Kherson region already today that basically it is now impossible to leave, at least directly to Ukrainian-held territory. In other parts of the country, the picture isn't quite as clear, but definitely Russia is not making it easy for people to leave to Ukrainian-held territory with any ease or any guarantee of safety. There are extraordinary stories of people having to do kind of thousands of kilometers journeys, traveling into Russian-occupied Crimea or across from Donetsk into Russia proper, and then traveling all the way through either Georgia into Turkey and getting back to Ukraine that way, or through Belarus trying to get into Lithuania or Poland. So people sometimes traveling thousands of kilometers just to get, 50, 100 kilometers down the road into Ukrainian-held territory near to where they came from.
Right. And now the world is holding its breath to see how Russia would defend these annexed regions.
Well, that's definitely the threat we've been hearing from pretty top-level people, including Vladimir Putin, in Moscow in recent days, that basically, yes, if they then recognize these territories as Russia proper, they would then be able to use the threat of nuclear retaliation if Ukraine were to try and regain these regions by force. I think so far there's not too much in the way of credence. There's not the real belief that this is for real. I think there is so far no sign that Russia has significantly brought its nuclear forces somehow into a greater state of readiness. But definitely it is a very dangerous situation. And we've seen Russia's willingness to escalate over those, fighting near those huge nuclear power stations in the south of Ukraine, both of which have had rockets explode on their perimeters. And there is a sense really that, this is basically Russia's last chance. It's losing on the battlefield. It doesn't seem able to really replenish its supplies of weapons, given the sanctions, given its lack of personnel. And now basically the big threat, the big kind of nuclear elephant in the room is the one last thing that they hope will at least, if not intimidate Ukraine, but then force people in Europe who've been supporting Ukraine to think twice and maybe put pressure on Kyiv to make some kind of compromise deal.
OK, thank you for that. DW correspondent Nick Connolly in Kyiv. One of the lesser reported aspects of this war is its effect on women and girls in Ukraine and around the world. So let's bring in Asa Regner. She's Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Deputy Executive Director of UN Women. She joins us from New York. Welcome to DW. Let's start in Ukraine. Explain to us how the war is affecting women and girls differently to men and boys.
Thank you so much for having me. Well, the war is devastating, obviously, on everyone. But we can see, for example, that since women had lower incomes than men to start with, their food insecurity and poverty is increasing more than men's. We see that the increased food prices had that effect on women, that they are often seen as responsible for food and cooking and so on, as in many countries, and therefore the higher prices have a great impact on their poverty rates. We also know that 90% almost of those who have fled Ukraine during the war are women with children. And we know that there is great risk, unfortunately, for trafficking and other forms of exploitation. For example, I would say forced pornography and different kinds of sexual exploitation of women and girls. We also know of documented cases of sexual violence against women in Ukraine by Russian soldiers. So there are many different ways that women are affected in a very, very concerning way by the war.
Yeah, I did want to ask you specifically about women in those areas of Ukraine that are occupied by Russians, and this is the threat of sexual violence particularly, is it?
Yes, that is one very big concern. That there has been, or there is an ongoing investigation that is mandated by the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and they came out with the first report on Friday, where they document several cases of sexual violence against women and girls, and even to me, who works with this on a daily basis all over the world, there are very upsetting information in that report. And obviously it is important that the UN and others really try our best for justice for women and girls. I want to also point out that although women are both victims of violence and other hardship during the war, they're also extraordinary leaders. And they are often those who support other women and people with big needs in the countrysides, maybe people with disabilities who can't move easily. And they actually also are in dialogue with us about the recovery of Ukraine, of course, also together with the government of Ukraine.
That's very clear. And more generally, your report talks about the problems being faced by women and girls being invisible. What do you mean by that?
That, as always, I mean, in terms of war, obviously everybody is affected, but we might hear more about what happens to most of all men, because the war is fought by men, and it is important to highlight what is actually happening to women and children in these situations. And what strikes me the most is that women are both really suffering the effects of war, but they're also doing incredible deeds for others in terms of highlighting other people's needs. For example, Ukraine is a war zone with a big percentage of elderly people, which we actually haven't really seen this way before. And that is a group, elderly women is a group that is not necessarily visible in wars.
Understood. Thank you so much for joining us. Asa Regner, Assistant to UN Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director of UN Women.
Thank you so much for having me.